In this video today, we are going to talk about self-affiliation, forced affiliation, and imitation versus friendship. Some of the ideas that we'll be talking about regarding these are the socialists and the OOAU, the Black Power movement under Malcolm X. We'll be talking about safety becoming secondary to any particular goal that you have. We'll be talking about Deng Xiaoping talking to Japanese leaders and claiming that China is a backwards country. We're going to talk about his issuing of management and what it meant for both Chinese pride and Western industrialization kind of concepts. We'll talk about Shanzhai, which is remixing. We'll talk about the Malcolm X statement of the chicken flying the coop. We'll talk about imitation and how it breeds copying and how copying breeds innovation. We'll talk about creating shows for friends who will invite their friends. We'll talk about American styles being imported to Japan, becoming static, museum-like because of explicit rules, and then we'll talk about how that relates to imitation. We'll be talking about Joanna Van Gogh and what she did for Vincent after his death, and then we'll be talking about the multiple stages of the creative process, including preparation, incubation, illumination, and verification. So let's hop right in. The first thing that I wanted to talk about in this video is self-affiliation. So I'll talk about forced affiliation in a second, because I think forced affiliation is something that feels a little bit more graspable, more intuitive. But I think self-affiliation is when you self-select into a particular group. There was no mandate culturally or from family or tradition that you should be a part of this particular group, but you choose to be a part of this particular group anyway. I think a good example of this would be kind of the self-selected cliques that you see in a high school situation, people who kind of imitate each other, and because of the act of imitating each other think, oh, we must share a lot in common, when in fact you're just both 15-year-olds who happen to grow up in the same area and have the same kind of interests. So interests group is another way of thinking of self-affiliation, and interest groups are interesting because they do become a pretty deep integral part of our identities. Our interest groups are kind of these self-selected communities that we feel the most pride about, that we feel the most kind of genuinely in line with, because we would be doing these things in isolation even if these other people didn't exist. So finding a community of them is really great. I think that this relates specifically to the first point that we just said about the books here, which is the NOI and Malcolm X affiliation to the NOI. So Malcolm X joined the NOI because initially his family was interested in trying to find some way to stay together, and Islam felt like a good reason for the family to stay together while Malcolm was in prison. And as he bought into Elijah's Muhammad's methods and methodologies, he quickly became one of the foremost ministers in the NOI, and his whole life began to revolve around the NOI, all the way through the meeting of his wife Betty Shabazz. But I think even specifically how he thought of himself was someone who was saved by Elijah Muhammad, someone who, when he was writing his book with Haley, he would go so far as to say that Elijah Muhammad saved him, right? And I think that this is interesting because this would count as a self-affiliation. Obviously, the NOI at the time, specifically in the kind of civil rights era powder keg that was the 1960s in the United States, there were different ways to integrate into the civil rights movement. You had the kind of Martin Luther King way of integrating into the civil rights movement, which was very much about kind of peaceful protest integration. And then you had the kind of NOI Garvey way of thinking, which was black separation. We need to get out of this country, which actually led them to work, as I said before, with the KKK and the American Nazi organization in certain times, because they both kind of shared that self-affiliation goal in a weird way, where they wanted to create separate groups of people. So I think that, what's interesting is that, like, there are other groups that can see the signals of your self-affiliation. So in this case, what I wrote down about the socialists that were hoping that this movement from the NOI, this kind of violence that Malcolm was kind of like leaning towards, would trigger a greater class revolt. So they kind of hoped that it would be kind of like a Harper Ferry raid, which was a raid led by an abolitionist named John Brown before the Civil War started, that served as kind of like a powder keg event for the Civil War, because it really ramped up the tension between the South and the North. And I think that, another good example of this is actually, we're jumping now to the Yankee movement in Japan, where, so not Yankee, it's like Yankee, but like the I is extended. And that group, the Yankee, were a conglomeration of American greaser style and kind of imagery from the Axis powers of World War II. So the Japanese Imperials, the Nazis with like a biker gang called themselves the Hitlers, apparently. And this was another version of self-affiliation. This was a group of people who considered themselves delinquents, who considered themselves bikers, who considered themselves removed from a certain part of society, who chose actively to show that by kind of merging these styles together, dressing in a certain way, acting in a certain way. And we saw this with the Bososo gang. We saw this with the Miyuki Dori, where people will kind of dress in a certain way and act in a certain way. They'll read a certain magazine like Men's Club or Popeyes that tells them to be a certain way, and then they become that. They're mutating their self to fit this image. And I think that, this idea of self-affiliation is interesting because, again, it only really lasts as long as you identify with these people, as long as you identify, actually not even with the people, with the activity. We've all had things that we've liked when we were younger that we've grown out of, and those things that we've grown out of feel like they're no longer resonant with the type of person that we are today. But by extension, we must also understand that there are things that we think of today that won't be resonant with how we feel about ourselves in the future. So being able to almost understand that self-affiliation has an expiry date is, I think, an important part of joining any kind of group or any kind of ideology, is understanding that ideologies expire with the people who believe them. Which I think leads into forced affiliation. So forced affiliation is different. Forced affiliation is, there is a steep punishment for leaving a forced affiliated group. This goes so far as like cults, obviously, but this also applies to family. So if you have a very religious family, a very Christian family, or a very Muslim family, or whatever that your particular kind of upbringing was, whether it was conservative, traditional, or hyper liberal, when you have two lesbian parents, there's a strict cost to breaking rank. And that strict cost of breaking rank is a forced affiliation in my mind, because it doesn't necessarily jive with what you want. And, there's a whole kind of litany of stories here. But I think a forced affiliation thing that I think is interesting to talk about here is the Deng Xiaoping going to Japan in the 1970s and basically admitting to Japan that China needs help. China is a backwards country. China had gotten caught up in the forced affiliation that was the rule of Mao Zedong, and because of that, they needed to catch up really quickly with the four modernizations to get up to what the rest of the world was doing. And I think that mission was something that Deng had to do very carefully. He had to make sure that he wasn't sacrificing Chinese pride in order to kind of get China more modern. So it's important to say, hey, even though we made mistakes and we're a part of these mistakes and we're partial to our development, we can't just make it feel like everything that we did was backwards, because, Japan, for example, during that same trip needed to apologize for the imperial actions that they took against the Chinese in World War II. And they didn't really do that. There's a whole history there that I think is really interesting and secondary to kind of like what we're talking about here, unrelated. But that kind of ties into two things that are kind of direct relations from that, which is management and the Shanzhai. So management is this idea that it was kind of again a cultural way for Deng Xiaoping to kind of introduce Western industrial concepts and send students abroad with the end goal of making China a rich country, with the end goal of making China a modern country that could compete on the industrial level. So it takes a certain amount of humility, which is, in my mind, a kind of forced affiliation in a way, right? This humility of being like, yeah, I don't know what's going on. It's both self-affiliation too, because you're like, there's a individual need to want to learn more, but then because of this like strict nationalism that almost was birthed of this moment too, it was a kind of forced affiliation. And I think that when it specifically applies to Shanzai, which is about remixing, or Shanzai, I don't know how to pronounce that, which is about remixing, is that there's a big cultural understanding in America that we our relationship with a country like China is that they copy, they imitate, and then that imitation breeds cheap imitations. But another book that I was reading, Creative Doing, talked about how imitating is actually how you get to copying, which is how you get to innovation. And I thought that was a really interesting stair-step way of thinking about things, that innovation is actually a third order effect of imitation. In order to be able to understand something, you need to, or to create something new, you need to understand it. And I think that we see that with Japanese fashion, with Popeye, with the cream soda in Harajuku, where these people these teenagers are reading these magazines like Men's Club and Popeyes and looking up to Van and kind of like Take Ivy, and they're just kind of copying the clothes that they see. They're imitating. They're like, how do we imitate exactly what the American Ivy style is doing? And then what they end up with is, 50 years later, American style itself is being led by Uniqlo, which is one of the biggest retailers in the world. As a matter of fact, this shirt is from Uniqlo that I'm wearing right now, right? And I think that that's really interesting because, we think about creativity as a form of, I would argue, a self-affiliation. Is this choosing to learn something, to do something, but in a way you kind of need to have this humility going in. You need to start from somewhere, and that starting does generally entail you having a amount of humility that allows you to imitate without saying that, I'm a backwards person. So I think that this brings me to my third point here, which is imitation versus friendship. So the whole point of this kind of affiliation talk is that, we will dress like people because we think that it allows us to get in with them. We'll act like people because we think that it allows us to get in with them. Friendship is a deeper relationship than imitation. Friendship is, no matter how you as an individual change, I will still be your friend. And that kind of level of platonic friendship is more rare than imitation. And I think that the reason for that is that imitation is just easier to come by. It's easier to kind of just have kind of these fair weather multiple groups of acting, this surface level way of doing things without having a deeper connection to other people, or even more specifically ourselves. So I think that the points that I want to discuss here are Joanna Van Gogh, prep, the 4 stages of creativity, and creating shows for your friends, and multiple surfaces for staging your work, and also safety being secondary to your goals. So actually a lot of things fit under this. So I can just go down the list here. So safety being secondary to your goals was after Malcolm turned 39, it was his last birthday, and he knew that his days were numbered. He was going really aggressively against the NOI, specifically after Elijah. It was kind of caught out in the multiple women that he had having children for him out of wedlock, and Malcolm was basically directly going after the NOI for that, and because of that, he attracted a lot of extra attention and death threats and attempts on his life that culminated in his assassination. But I think what was interesting is that, like, the way that he pursued that last year of his life was still in such a way that he cared more about Pan-Africanism than his own safety. And I think that's partially because of the rhetoric that he used, which was very kind of like threatening and violent. And even though he never really was directly violent, he was like, hey, if something happens type of way of talking. And because of that, he obviously opened himself up, I think, to more people who would be violent against him. But I think that this idea of safety becoming secondary to goals is kind of what would happen in a true friendship. If you have somebody who is a part of your gang or somebody who's a part of your organization, and then they decide to turncoat, and you're like, damn, Dave turncoated, but I really do love Dave. Like, Dave is like my really close friend. I want what's best for Dave. Then what you'll do is that you'll still be friends with Dave, expecting the cost of the rest of the group being backlashed against you as well. All of a sudden, you'll be bundled with Dave, who is now split from the group. You'll be treated as a pariah as well. So to do that does take an element of loyalty. It takes an element of kind of greater concern for something that isn't the group itself and the image that the group that affiliates with it. So the multiple surfaces for staging work, to take a crazy pivot, is that there's this notion of like private and public that has been very rapidly changing because of the notion of the internet and kind of how you can access people's ideas 24/7 and you can upload your ideas 24/7. And I think because of that, we've ended up in a place where we've created these kind of independent group chats that are kind of private, and then we have like completely public channels like YouTube pages, for example, and then we have, you know, the interiority of our own thoughts. And I think that the in this book, Creative Doing, Surfaces was really interesting because it was basically making the point that you should create things that you have different kind of proof points for different groups of people. So you might have a finished product for the general public. Then you have like your feedback group, which could be like editors or close friends or people who help you kind of progress along your way. And then you have your draft, which is kind of like where you're giving feedback to yourself. And I thought that that was really interesting, specifically for these kind of stages of creativity: the preparation stage, the incubation stage, the illumination stage, and the verification stage. Because what is really important about, again, about kind of being open-minded, being flexible to your own creative process, is being able to detach yourself from it. So again, there's a self-affiliation that is connected to this idea of like, oh, I need to work really hard about this thing needs to go well, or I am a failure. And the separation of the thing from yourself is a really difficult task. And I have numbers of stories about this in the software that I've created, as well as kind of like different companies that I've started that have kind of ostensibly failed. And I think that a lot of that does take a big toll on your identity. So choosing the right kind of task, choosing the right kind of surfaces, making sure that they're detached from the core value of you, is a very important part to being a successful creative in the modern internet world we've created. Because there is also an argument that, like, you know, even if you don't want to be a creator on the internet, and you don't want to talk too much about yourself or your own life as a kind of daily vlog person and open yourself up to the scrutiny of the public, you are kind of leaving money on the table in the way that the current economy works with how people shop on the internet and how people exist, monetarily. So it's like, if you do want to free yourself from certain kind of categories where you need signaling or you need kind of the admission of somebody to allow you to work under a thing, you should be interested in giving yourself the opportunity to, you know, create shows for your friends who invite your friends, bring opportunity into your life by using what's accessible to you, making sure that when you're making something that you believe is quality or important, that you give it the chance that it needs to succeed, but also not becoming too obsessed with the process itself. I think finally that'll lead me to Joanna van Gogh, who was the stepsister of Vincent van Gogh. She was married to Theo, Vincent's brother, who died 6 months after Vincent died. And I think what's really interesting about Joanna's story is that she was the one who really popularized all of Vincent's work. After Vincent died, he was still a relatively unknown artist. He wasn't completely unknown. There was a critic whose name I can't remember, who wrote a piece on Vincent while he was in the insane asylum, and that kind of caught a lot of attention. But, you know, after Joanna van Gogh he basically got all of these works because they were owned by Theo, because Theo was kind of bankrolling Vincent while he was alive. And so she was kind of in an awkward position where she was like, how do I make this art matter? So she brought it all back with her to the Netherlands and made all these exhibitions. I wrote down 20 exhibitions in a decade. But a big move that she did was publishing the letters in between Theo and Vincent, because they had such this kind of deep brotherly relationship that was very sad. And one of my favorite books, I think, is up here, is, yeah, it's here somewhere. Oh, right here, is Vincent van Gogh, the biography by Stephen Nafia. It's so sad. It's like one of those things where you're like, it can't get worse. His life can't get worse, and then it gets worse. But he just wanted friends. He just wanted to be accepted, and I think that ties it back into again to the self-affiliation thing, where Vincent became an artist later in his life. Actually, he initially tried to be a pastor because his father was a pastor, and he worked some menial jobs. He was a teacher for a little bit. He walked around a lot. He was a weird guy, but I think that he really just wanted to create a group of people who cared about him, and a group of people who could work with him and kind of indulge each other in the beauty of life. And I think that if I'm going to wrap up this video, it'll be on that note. It'll be on this note that whether you are, working for the NOI like Malcolm X, whether you are and pursuing a lifestyle that's going to get you killed, or whether you're a leader of a country like Deng Xiaoping and you're trying to figure out how to get China into a better position than when you inherited it, or whether you are just a creator who's trying to figure out, how do I copy something? Do I feel guilty about copying something in my path to innovating something else? How do I share my work in a way that actually matters? Whether you're a teenager in Japan in the 1970s who's in a biker gang called Hitler, or you're the sister of which will become one of the most famous artists of all time, stepsister. It's the same thing. It's value your friendships. Don't be afraid to imitate on the path to getting better. Don't get too stuck in any affiliation, whether it's self or forced. Great. So if you liked this video, I am offering one-on-one reading, kind of like personal training, where I can help you look at your idiosyncratic systems around your own reading and help you improve your reading systems. So if that interests you, there is a link to a form in the description below. Have a good one.